Since it's nearly Halloween, I wanted to make a quick list of my favourite horror films. Everyone already knows I'm a huge fan of survival horror, but did you also know I love horror films too? I know, fucking crazy, right? So without further ado, here are my top 10 favourite horror films of all time. Bottom of my list is the original Scream. This film probably hasn't aged as well as other movies on this list, since slasher films are a dime a dozen in the horror genre these days, but Scream was almost revolutionary when it came out. The film still has one of the greatest openings to any horror film ever, and even more surprising is the fact that the film is genuinely funny at times. Scream is complete nonsense, but enjoyable nonsense nonetheless. And come on, any film that features a young Courtney Cox has to show up on my list somewhere. A lot of people will probably disagree with this choice, and to be honest, I don't think it's an amazing film either, but for everything it accomplished on such a minuscule budget, I think it deserves a place on this list. It basically created the found footage genre of horror movie. It had incredibly believable performances, especially when you consider that everyone in the film had no real experience in acting, and the ending still gives me chills every time I see it. The Blair Witch Project is not the best horror film ever made, but it was much better than it had any right to be.
This weapon will be called the Terminator.
You're dead, honey.
Okay, to a lot of people this is going to be considered cheating. A lot of people don't consider the Terminator a horror film. Some people call it a sci-fi movie, some people call it an action movie, but to me it's a horror movie. Not an especially scary horror movie, but a horror movie nonetheless. I mean, the Terminator is basically an unstoppable killing machine who will stop at nothing until you are dead. How is he any different from a Freddy Krueger, a Jason Voorhees, or a Xenomorph? The Terminator is still an excellent film to this day. Yeah, some of the special effects haven't aged especially well, but it is still a well-paced and incredibly tense film that made Arnold Schwarzenegger a household name. If for some crazy reason you still haven't seen this one yet, I highly recommend checking it out, along with its incredible sequel. I was hesitant to put this film on the list, because it's not really something I would recommend to everyone, especially people who are squeamish at the sight of blood. It's easily the goriest film on this list, sometimes excessively so. Even now, I sometimes struggle to view the whole thing. It's a nasty, cruel, disgusting little film, but I think that's why I love it. It pulls no punches and doesn't give a fuck whether you find it appropriate or not. It's the only film on this list that makes me cry every time at the ending. It's a truly terrifying experience that will have you checking the locks on your door every night before you go to bed. It's also incredibly well directed, with some of the best use of lighting I've ever seen in a horror film. I also need to give a quick shout out to the two lead females who give absolutely stunning performances. I can almost guarantee you no other horror film will leave an impact on you quite like this one. I really don't want to say too much about this film, because figuring out what's going on is half the fun. All I'll say is that it's easily one of the scariest films on this list, with one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking stories in the entire genre. A photographer starts getting severe back pains one day, and doctors are stunned by what could possibly be causing it. That's all I'll say for now. Trust me, it's a great film, and you should check it out. I love Wreck. It's a dumb little found footage film, but it does the concept so much better than any other horror film I've seen. Wreck is basically your traditional zombie movie. A news reporter investigates a building where some of the occupants have begun acting strangely. What follows from there is basically a non-stop fight for survival for the people trapped inside. The plot is incredibly simplistic. None of the characters get any meaningful development, and it's all over far too quickly. But for the 90 or so minutes the film does last, it's an absolute thrill ride from start to finish, and I loved it.
どんなビデオか聞いたことある？ 私が聞いたのは、なんかいきなり怖い女の人が映って、お前は1週間後に死ぬって、そういうのなんですけど。
To be honest, I was undecided for a long time about whether to put the American version or the Japanese version of this film on the list. I love both, but for very different reasons. For example, I think the American videotape scene is more disturbing, but I think the Japanese ending is more terrifying. In the end, I went with the Japanese version, since it's the original, but both are still great. Ringu is an incredibly important film. It basically popularised the psychological horror genre, and showed us that not every horror film needs to be a bloody gore fest. I was barely able to sleep for a week after I first saw the film. It's incredibly unsettling. I absolutely loved the ending. For a period of time, the film seems like it's heading towards a happy conclusion, only for the movie to completely flip your expectations on their head a few minutes later. You probably have already guessed this, but I absolutely love The Ring. If this top 10 list was based purely on how many times I've watched a particular movie, then Alien would easily top this list by quite a large margin. It's probably the only horror film I find myself watching at least once a year. What even needs to be said about the film at this point? It's a classic. It has the most terrifying creature design of any horror film, in my honest opinion. The xenomorph is truly the thing of nightmares, and when you watch this film, you'll understand exactly why that is. Excellent performances from the entire cast, with a star-making role for the brilliant Sigourney Weaver. Some might argue that the plot is rather simplistic compared to other horror films, but that's exactly the point. It's humans fighting to stay alive against an unstoppable creature, pure and simple. Alien is truly a horror masterpiece, and I implore you to check it out if for some reason you still haven't seen it. Whenever I mention this film to people who would consider themselves huge fans of horror films, I'm shocked by how few have either never seen the film or have never even heard of the film. In a way, I guess that's understandable, since Don't Look Now isn't your everyday horror film. In fact, outside of its final few moments, it can barely be considered a horror movie at all. But my god, that ending. I won't spoil it here, suffice to say I had nightmares for days afterwards, and I'm not the kind of guy who usually gets nightmares to begin with. Don't Look Now is also beautifully shot, with most of the film taking place in the stunning Italian city of Venice. Donald Sutherland gives an amazing performance as a man struggling to piece his life back together after the sudden death of his daughter. You really feel for his character, which makes some of the later scenes in the film seem almost cruel. Haunting would be the best word I'd use to describe Don't Look Now. A lot of people would argue that A Tale of Two Sisters also isn't really a traditional horror film. I mean, there aren't really that many scenes that could be considered scary. Instead, the film focuses more on making the viewer feel consistently unsettled. Throughout most of the film, it's easy to feel like something isn't quite right with the family living in this house, and finding out why that might be is incredibly intriguing. There are some twists in this film that I can almost guarantee you won't see coming, and even when you finally feel you've figured out everything going on in the movie, 2 or 3 new unanswered questions will arise. With an excellent soundtrack, fantastic plot, and one of the most heartbreaking endings of any horror film, A Tale of Two Sisters is easily my favourite horror film of all time.